Hello everyone again. It's me, Andy Wilson, for the Traveller in the Evening. And we've got quite a variety of podcasts of late, covering quite a range of topics. I'm going to do something a bit different again tonight, which is we're going to attempt a bit of a biography of myself by way of providing some background as to sort of where the Traveller in the Evening is coming from. And it's a funny thing running a Substack, especially one like mine, where again, from week to week, the topics might vary quite a lot, from talking about the Old Testament to talking about revolutionary politics last week and points in between, as you'll know if you've seen the blog. My point is that every time I publish something, a few people, they don't unsubscribe, they opt out of emails. It's always interesting to see because, the people who've sort of joined the blog because they're interested in some of the politics, then a few of them opt out of emails because they don't want to know about art. And it seemed to me that that's happening on the one hand, and that's just kind of interesting from the point of view of running a blog. But it did make me think about the broad range of the topics we talk about on The Traveller in the Evening. And another thing that occurred to me is that when I first went on the internet, which will be back in the sort of mid to late 90s, all the assumptions were that, you could be anybody you wanted on the internet. You could make up a persona for yourself and be anybody you liked. You could take on several personas. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. There always was, and there still is. But at the same time, with social media, I found almost the opposite was happening. You were sort of increasingly disintermediated because, I'm on Facebook and I've got friends on Facebook who I was in the Navy with. The last time I saw them was 40 years ago. We were drinking in the Navy. I've got friends there who are revolutionary communists. I've got friends who are in bands that I've been in. My mum's my friend on Facebook, and it's quite difficult to present different personas to everybody on the one Facebook wall. So there's this kind of tendency, as well as the ability to, if you like, misrepresent yourself online. At the same time, there's a tendency to disintermediate, and it made me think about the Traveller in the Evening blog. And again, this kind of fairly wide range of topics, from revolutionary politics, theology, art, surrealism, and so on. It made me think that maybe I needed to try and connect some of those things biographically to say how the Traveller in the Evening arose as a blog, what it was trying to achieve, and where I'm coming from personally that informs the choices that are made about what we talk about on the blog. So it was with that in mind, I thought it might be useful to have a bit of biography of myself. And I thought, well, who better to sort of beat it out of me, if not my old comrade, Conor, who's been on several of these talks with me. But for those who don't already know him, is an old friend of mine. We met at university in the early 80s, and we've been active in politics together on and off ever since. So we've remained in touch ever since. So what I'm going to do is throw the ball over to Conor. And from that point on, really, Conor, you're in the driving seat, because the point is to try and get some sense out of me as to what coheres, the point of view that's expressed in the Traveller in the Evening. And I guess normally the premise there would be that there is something that coheres it, and I'm often not that sure that there is. So part of your job is to try and find out if you can see any sense in it. But there you go. So over to you, Conor. I'm from this point on, I'm in your hands.
Yeah, that's interesting introduction. Because the obvious cohering theme is Blake, which you set the whole first a website and then the podcast and the Substack around that. But by way of preparation for tonight, I listened back to our chat about what the Traveller in the Evening was intended to be. This is 18 months ago, in November 2023. You and I had about a 40-minute conversation, and it is very interesting to listen to ourselves in the light of the journey we've been on. And I imagine your community around the Substack and the people listening to this, we've all been on this journey together in the last 18 months, and it's quite valuable to remind ourselves. I mean, some people might discover your podcast, right, and then get binge it, right, but others will have travelled over 18 months And my God, it's not the evening; it's night. And I don't think I know, speaking for myself anyway, I did not anticipate where the world would be 18 months. I asked you back then, 18 months ago, why the title, Traveller in the Evening, and you explained the Blake connection. But the darkness that was growing over us then was that of environmental crisis. That was in the forefront of our minds. And the sense in which we were at the end of things was to do with the environment. But I think that's been overtaken, hasn't it? It's fascism now, and at a pace I was absolutely not thinking of. So let's. I know you want to talk biographically, but let's start at the wrong end of a biography. So look, 18 months has been you've been doing this project for 18 months. And do you not feel that the world around you has been getting darker and darker as you've done it?
I think all reasonable people feel something like that. I mean, things are changing for the worse. You're right to say the focus then, I think what was more in the forefront of the mind 18 months ago what was more the environmental crisis. And that's been displaced by the whole Trump phenomenon. But of course, as everybody listening to this will already have realised, these things are deeply implicated. One is a kind of response to the other. So it's not that they're unrelated. It's just that that's really the focus of our attention has changed again, largely because of the rise of Trump. I mean, he certainly dominates the news at the moment, in terms of the tariff war that he's conducting, and he's upping the ante and then backing down, and it's chaos for the markets. So that absolutely dominates our attention. Of course, hasn't made any difference at all to the underlying crisis. In fact, it's going to exacerbate it because we've now got a president in America who's openly contemptuous of the whole idea of environmental crisis. Is not the topic of the evening, but I can't help but mention something I heard on the news this week, which was a story about Trump and his attitude both to the national debt and the environmental crisis. And the gist of this report was that several independent sources in different times had reported Trump saying similar things about those two phenomena, again, the national debt and environmental crisis. And he seemed to mean it, which is that I'll be dead by then, so I don't really give a fuck. I won't be paying back the national debt. I won't be facing the consequences. It really doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that in because it's been on my mind quite a bit this week. So I think the underlying crisis is the same, but the political turn towards illiberalism and its generalisation has been on our minds more of late.
Back 18 months ago, I asked why was Blake such a critical figure? And you gave a biographical answer. You explained that you'd studied in college. You hadn't felt that you'd studied him that deeply, although when you went back to his books that you had, you'd actually found you'd annotated them pretty heavily. And then you explained that why you felt he was a key figure. So I think you should probably revisit that question now, 18 months on. And is your feeling that that was right, that Blake is an absolutely critical figure at this juncture? And has anything changed in that 18 months? You've done a lot of sparring with other thinkers, people involved in the Blake Society, people who've published books on Blake and so on. And what's changed in your appreciation of Blake in the last 18 months?
In the last 18 months, nothing, in the sense that he remains completely central to my thoughts. But there are two different dimensions to this. There's the purely biographical angle, which is my coming across Blake almost by accident, really. I have told this story before, but essentially when I was part of the AMM, as the group was called, and we were publishing various books. We published a book about poetry, which talked about Blake, but it led to a huge schism in our group, the AMM, with the poet Sean Bonney having a furious row with Ben Watson out to lunch, and it led to the group splitting, and it was all about Blake. And of course, perfectly reasonably, I had to take a view in these matters, and I started reading Blake. It's not so much that I was intellectually, persuaded by him very quickly, but he just started to completely dominate my thoughts with his imagery at first. Found myself incredibly attracted to him. And that's not normally how you tell these stories, about you discover ideas in a thinker and you think you agree with them or something. But with me, it was much more just being drawn to Blake's many peculiarities. First person, a long way to have been drawn to his peculiarities. But I mean that there was something overwhelming about whatever it was he represented. And I wasn't entirely sure at first. Of course, I'm still not. For quite a while, I just had no idea really what he did represent. I mean, the attraction preceded that. It took a long time and a lot of engaging with Blake before I began to form my own picture of what was behind the attraction that I had. But the attraction it was the main thing. And the idea of the traveller in the evening comes from an image in Blake of the traveller hasteth in the evening. It's this image of the guy, which becomes the logo for the blog, of the traveller with his walking stick pacing forward. And it's also the title of a book by the great Blake scholar Morton Paley about the later Blake, The Traveller Hasteth in the Evening. Also, he truncates it to the traveller in the evening. And of course, the traveller is us humans passing through life. It's based somewhat, obviously, on Bunyan's Pilgrim and that kind of imagery. And the way I related to that personally was as someone who was beginning to engage with Blake. But at my age, I was approaching retirement. And in fact, I retired a couple of years early, a few years ago. And I saw myself as the traveller in the evening. And the evening in two senses. The evening in my life, the later part of my life, after retirement, I really wanted to engage with Blake. But it seemed to me that it was also the evening in another sense, that sense of the drawing in of night, of, the approaching environmental crisis, the rise of illiberalism. There was that feeling of being abroad in the evening as well. So there was that kind of personal background to my relation to Blake informing, the decision to start the blog. But in terms of the relevance of Blake, I mean, that's only deepened for me as I've got to understand him better. I don't think there's been any great change in how I see Blake in the last 18 months, but there's always this development of your understanding of Blake. And it seems to me that he is such an extraordinary character. And obviously, this is not the place to go into this at length. But what I want to say is that it seems to me that Blake represents a different kind of personality to the other models we have of his age. In some ways, he's coming out of the past. He feels like a peasant antinomian, a Civil War ranter. There's that aspect to him. But in some ways, he represents the future. Personality and his demeanour, what he represents, and in the fusion in his thought of wildly different ideas in incredibly constructive ways is something that we should be, that I think comes from the future. The surrealist Sufo said of Blake that he represents a mountaintop. He's not something in the past that you see as an influence. It's something that you look up to and aspire to. And that kind of sense of Blake still dominates my impression of him. And that hasn't changed at all, even though the topics of some of the posts on the blog have changed in the last 18 months. But it's not due to any change in focus on Blake.
Yeah, and you said before that you had an epiphany related to Blake's statement that the imagination is the body of Christ. And your epiphany was that he meant it. Well, you could explain how it felt to you, but that it's the human imagination is what gives access to the real. I'll hand it over to you, right? But so anyway, so that epiphany hasn't changed obviously in the last 18 months. But I'd had this thought that maybe you've got an increased credence for idealism and less for physicalism over the course of this journey.
I mean, to be honest, it's for other people to decide, isn't it, really? I don't really get much out of debating those things. I mean, I spent a lot of time in my life worried about not being a materialist. Now, is this materialist? We have to take a materialist point of view. And one of the things about Blake was just his let's say, his manner of presenting things. It just discards all of that. He has an incredibly monistic view, but it's probably, it's not, I don't want to get into this. It's not like absolute idealism or that kind of thing. That's a philosophical position, but it's a kind of idealism for sure. And I found that really, what's the word, mind blowing when I got, obviously I've heard people argue similar things, but when you experience it in Blake, he says these amazing things about, is the body being that part of the soul perceived by the senses, which is just such an incredibly convoluted, perfectly terse image that's absolutely typical of him. But the business about the imagination, I want to say it's so fundamental to Blake, but at the same time, it took me a while to realize exactly how fundamental it was. And that came with thinking about something he says about, the human imagination is the body of Christ. He uses the similar phrase a few times, like variations. But there's the idea, the imagination is the body of Christ. And like a lot of things in Blake, it sounds terribly grand, deep, and these kind of things. And you sort of think about it and say, well, what is he really trying to say here? What's he comparing, imagination to Christ? What's this comparison about? And I thought about those kind of things, as many people must have done, as they come across such an extraordinary phrase, really. Imagination is the body of Christ. As a bald statement, it doesn't pass at first. What does he mean by this? So I was thinking those kind of thoughts, as I suppose most people will have who've read that Blake. But it just eventually, or finally, because I thought about it so much without really getting any particular insight into it, it was one of those things when the penny dropped, and I suddenly realised he kind of meant it absolutely literally. It's not a loose manner of speaking. But that in itself is a kind of, what does it mean to take that literally? The imagination is the body of Christ. And then I realised that, and I'm going to speak pretty loosely here, like I'm trying to explain it to students or something like that. So, just bear with me. But he says, the imagination is the body of Christ. And I thought, well, let's assume he's kind of speaking in some kind of idealist way. That would make it easier to make that sort of equation. He's speaking in some kind of idealist way. In what sense could imagination be the body of Christ? Now, first of all, just bear in mind that, that Christ is God to Blake. Blake is very much a Christian. And Trinitarianism or not, he's a kind of Christ-led Christian, if you know what I mean, as opposed to Old Testament Jehovah-led, the Father, with all of the implications of that. He's kind of got his Christ front and center in his conception of God. And what it made me think of was this idea of the primum mobile, of God as being the person who sets everything in motion. And that's actually a deistic idea. It's an idea of Newton's in a way. His mechanics explains how energy is transformed from one form into another, let's say. But how the energy got there, that's God's business. And the idea is that God sets things in motion, and then there's the necessary laws, physical laws that govern further transformation of matter, yeah? But God is doing the work here. God is the creator. And in an idealist mental universe, what that means is that the imagination, like God, is the creator of everything. Everything in our perception that we're told, by empiricists, trying to channel Blake here, is received through the senses. But everything we experience has been filtered by the imagination, and not just our own imagination, but we're socialized into the collective imagination of endless generations of those who came before us. And we inherit that, and we live in that imaginative world. And when I say imagination, Blake is so closely associated with the imagination, and I think people assumed he just means like artist, doesn't he, and beautiful thoughts and ideas and images. But the imagination is Trump. Trump is the product of the human imagination. The state is the product of the human imagination. All of our relations are the product of the collective human imagination, and then we are agents within all that with our own imagination. But the basic deal is that when it comes to the world of the mind and perception, the imagination is all powerful. And it's the imagination that precedes the other stuff. This idea does crop up in the history of philosophy, but not as often as you'd think. And another place where it crops up is in the famous debate between Coleridge and Wordsworth over the imagination, where Wordsworth insisted that the imagination was a kind of was the ability to recombine the elements we had first received in the senses. So we receive in the senses the idea of a man, and we receive the idea of a horse, and then the imagination glues bits of them together, and creates the idea of a centaur, for example. But it's a recombinative kind of power of the mind. But for Coleridge, the imagination was the power of the mind to actually create what didn't exist before, not merely to recombine, but to create ex novo, like God creating the universe. And the idea of the pure imagination creating freely and its similarity to God creating the universe may not be just a similarity in Blake, but I'll leave it there because that's not what we're here to talk about.
Another related evolution over the 18 months, I think, is your relationship to Timothy Morton. And it cannot be a coincidence that both of you recognised Blake in the similar way as central to their understanding and to where the world's at.
To explain, the role of Blake in my relation to Tim, as it turned out, is really quite a biographical thing, because I suppose the one thing we ought to explain before then is what is this OOO you mentioned, and that's quite a nerdy, specific thing, a kind of approach to philosophy, object-oriented ontology, with which Tim is associated, along with people, primarily Graham Harman and a number of other people. And there was a kind of quite a splash about it a few years ago. There's less attention paid to it now, and it's controversial from certain points of view. I really, really like it, but I'm not, again, we haven't time to go into it. But it's quite a detailed argument about the OOO bit. The attraction to Tim was kind of a slightly different thing, and it's really started when the Blake Society in their journal, Vala, decided to have a special about Blake and nature. And I wanted to write something for it. I was talking to Sibylla, who's the chair of the Blake Society, and I was talking to her about different angles I might take. And I asked her to recommend some reading. And she said, "Oh, you ought to read this person, Timothy Morton, writer Timothy Morton." And so I thought I had to do that. And I think the first thing I read was, we read it together, Conor. As part.
Yeah, all art is ecological.
All art is ecological. And it's very pithy, aphoristic, dense and whatever, but has some lovely, lovely moments in it. And straight away, he was talking about how do you relate to nature. He says, well, spend some time with your cat. That's relating to nature. And there's a lot of little things like that I really, really liked. There was something very refreshing about what I could make out about his take on ecological questions. But he went on to, well, he'd already written a series of books, which I went on to read, is probably a better way to put it, and sort of engaging with this idea of hyper-objects. He describes the ecology or ecological disaster as a whole as a hyper-object, but so is capitalism, but so are many other things. It's this fascinating OOO type idea, a hyper-object, which I was attracted to and got Tim a lot of attention. But it wasn't the what sealed the deal, as it were. I just thought it was really interesting stuff, and I read more and more of Tim's work and found him increasingly engaging, and his way of doing philosophy I really like. It is itself very creative. It's not a crabby, pedantic kind of thing. It's a very passionate and committed kind of philosophy. So I was into him. And but at that point, while I was thinking that about what I was reading, I was very much into Blake, and I was increasingly becoming a Christian, which was a very strange and protracted process for somebody like me who'd never been remotely religious, really, and have been a militant materialist as a Marxist. That's what Marxists like to call themselves, but they've got to be militant even in their materialism, of course. Well, it just means they're very, very, very materialist. But what they're very, very, very materialist really means in practice is just that they're very, very rude about and ignorant of theology and religion. They just put a big distance between themselves and it, and they don't really know much about it. But coming from that background and been on the soft end of that, to be honest, even in that milieu, I would have been much more open to have to speak to a religious person, to have a discussion with them, and not to dismiss them, I would say. But nevertheless, even to me, it was a big shock to discover that I might be a Christian, and it came through very much through engaging with Blake, because I realised that I was seeing the world increasingly in a Blakean sort of way as I understood it. And one thing that I was about to say, one thing you cannot deny about Blake is that he was a Christian, except, of course, loads of people deny it now. It's quite popular to deny that he was a Christian. You know, what would Blake know about whether he was a Christian or not? Let me tell you, sort of thing. So, yes, there is some people somehow managed to doubt whether Blake was a Christian. But having identified with his thought in some way and not being an idiot, realising that he was a Christian, I realised that meant that probably so was I by this point. And I know that's an odd way to describe it's not a flash of insight, but it was the beginning of my relationship, and realising that I was a Christian was just to realise that I was seeing the world in a Blakean kind of way. And that is a deeply Christian way, as I understood it. So that was a big surprise to me. And it was through Blake. So I'm kind of liking what Tim was writing about hyperobjects, OOO, ecology. He has this idea that he always spells nature with a big N, and he says it's basically bullshit, the whole idea of nature with a capital N defined in that way. And he has a whole load of other really interesting things going on in his thought. And that, I thought that anyway. But at this point, I was also becoming a Christian through reading Blake. So when I read that Timothy Morton's next book was going to be about William Blake and to tell the story of how he had become a Christian, I obviously was immediately, all my lights went on. And I thought, well, that's quite remarkable, because I liked the gist of his thought. It was extraordinary. We ended up arriving at similar conclusions, probably in completely different ways. I don't make any comparison between myself and Tim in any other way, but that was quite remarkable. I just thought, well, that's a kind of fairly remarkable thing, because what I saw as a similarity in approach, by the way, Tim had drawn conclusions that I had never got anywhere near. I mean, this is one of the really impressive things about him, is he was really willing to go out on a limb. In a way, I'm not. I find myself, I think all these things are relative, but I find myself haunted by I shouldn't really think that. I know what a materialist would say to that. It's like, you've got this devil on your shoulder always telling you to back off. And Tim doesn't really have that devil. He just leaps in. As I put it, when I reviewed the Blake book, it's the tech bros talk about move fast and break things. And Tim reminded me very much of move fast and connect things. He leapt over long periods of time, big areas of philosophy, and connected a lot of really interesting things together. So that from the fact of that to realising he'd become a Christian under Blake's influence while thinking all of that just seemed too much like a coincidence. It didn't seem like either a coincidence or the opposite, but it very much struck me, and I wanted to. So I offered actually to the Blake Society to review Tim's book for their next, issue, and got the go-ahead to do that. So then started to engage with Tim and arranged for him to do a meeting for the Blake Society, actually, where I interviewed him. So, yeah, we've had a lot of interesting things to talk about, Tim and I. It's been fantastic.
I do wonder how isolated a journey that's been. Is there a resurgence of a much deeper critique of society than has been in the past, using Christian sort of thought to really get to the heart of the beast. I haven't done this journey myself. I am still a physicalist of, and I wouldn't. I am uncomfortable with any label, especially Trotskyist. Definitely not Marxist. Maybe, but so I'm not saying this personally, but I think there's a lot of it around. A sort of, like the bishop who stood up to Trump. I mean, that was pretty awesome, and there must be communities like that.
I mean, I get why people are looking at Trump, for example, are extremely dubious about any kind of religion. It would be a bit of a cop-out if I were to say, well, that's organised religion or something like that. I mean, I understand why people have been proud to be atheists and stuff like that. But the thing that really came through to me, well, actually, I'll tell a story the other way around and say something that happened very, very recently that I found quite convincing in this regard, was when Elon Musk described empathy as a bug in the capitalist system. And this is such an interesting idea, and he's absolutely right. From the point of view of capitalism, the job of capitalism is to squeeze out any last trace of empathy and turn everything into a properly functioning machine that doesn't ask any questions. So he's right, and from that point of view. But then I thought, well, not only is he right about that, but that is the right way to describe the fundamental struggle that we face, which is to defend those human things against a machine that some people want to accelerate in its attack on us. And clearly Trump is enabling, this attack to take place. So this is, to me, at the centre of things, this idea about empathy. And I was speaking to someone today and saying, well, in Christianity, the idea of solidarity is the idea that you should have empathy for everybody, especially your enemy, not only your enemy. Well, it's this universal thing in Christianity. If you compare that with Marxism, it doesn't matter how fancy Trotsky gets with, in their morals and ours, trying to make something look like a moral position. The basic position of Marxism is that, and from a materialist point of view, empathy is only something that's it would be a crude materialism. See, I'm worried about misrepresenting Marxism. I don't care. All right. So basically, a crude Marxist would say empathy is just about class solidarity, supporting members of your own class with whom you have a common interest, right? You've got to defend one another. There's a kind of crude Darwinian logic to that. A more sophisticated Marxism will say, well, we've generalized that kind of class solidarity into a slightly more wider reaching idea of human solidarity. But it absolutely has this class foundation. It doesn't begin as human solidarity. So I'm saying that, and you can say this is a very abstract way of looking at things. I don't care. I think it gets to the heart of the matter, is that Marxism doesn't have an explanation for human solidarity except as sort of human self-interest, generalized somewhat, but nevertheless pure self-interest. And it began to seem to me that whatever one thinks about people's impression of what the history of religion is, or the history of the church, certainly they have an idea about that. But ignoring all of that, just for a moment, it seemed to me that only something like Christianity had a response to something like capitalism. And that's why a few weeks ago, Conor, I was really pressing you about how does anarchism specifically reply to the specific problem that we face in the world today? Because I was trying to dig out of you the equivalent thing. There's a perfect symmetry between Christianity and capitalism in my mind, in that Christianity is absolutely opposed to capitalism on principle. You don't have to be a genius or a very sophisticated theologian. You just have to read, the New Testament, the basic Gospels, where it's pretty plain that Christianity is a kind of communistic cult. I wouldn't reduce it to a communistic cult, but certainly from an outsider's point of view, it's a communistic cult. And And so to me, there's that deep symmetry and a deep connection, which makes the necessity of a Christian communism, it implies that that's a necessary part of the answer to our problems.
No, I'm not going to get sidetracked into talking about Kropotkin. People can dig around and find those old episodes. But let's stay with your evolution and perhaps the evolution of the listeners. Is there any distinction between your favourite pieces that you've written or had guests produce for the podcast and the Substack, and those which have got the most traction, those which people most engage with?
Broadly, no. And I'm not very good at this kind of thing, reading stats. I know you're a bit of an expert, Conor, and you're very driven by that. I'm not, but I can't deny being curious. And the things that have really interested listeners and readers of the blog, one thing was the recent. It ended up being a 3-part series of talks I did with John Game. It was about the rise and fall of the extra-parliamentary left of the Labour Party left since the end of the Second World War through to today, split into 3 parts, but really the subject matter is really split into 2, which was the rise of the revolutionary left after the Second World War, from a tiny beginning to quite small end, but nevertheless the rise of the revolutionary left. The revolutionary left has never had an organisation as big as the Scientologists, for example, in Britain. So, just to give everything a sense of proportion. But nevertheless, there was a huge rise in those terms for the first half of the period under discussion, which was 1945 to 1985. But 1985, the defeat of the miners' strike, was, for us in this discussion, was taken to being at the beginning of another 40 years of decline of the labour movement. And so we told that story, and a lot of people were very interested in that. But it really seems remarkable to me that a lot of people were very interested also in an interview I did, a podcast with Phil Smith about, hauntology, and talking a little bit about, the sort of post-occupied generation of leftists. And there's a lot of interest in that. The most popular article on the blog is one I wrote about the Book of Job. And it's a huge essay. Right. And it's very, very popular for some reason. So maybe someone put it on a course.
Your challenge to me was to investigate whether something coheres this project. And I think something does. And I think the thing that does is a desire for a better world, and that people coming looking for deep answers to how do we get to a better world are often, many of them may have come from having tried the Marxist route. Well, I say many, in relative terms to the
Scientologists,
those following, and then but I think also there will be people who join this blog and podcast from taking a Blakean point of view of things does allow you to go deep, and I think it makes sense to me. That's one of my favourite pieces on the blog is your work on Job. It's tremendous. Another favourite of mine is your insight into Philip K. Dick and his empathy with animals. And I think that's an original take, wide attention. And so I suppose as well there's a countercultural quality to what you're doing, which is important because, if you're somebody looking for alternatives to capitalism, you're looking for countercultural takes, not just politics.
That's a big thing with me. I don't think it's a coincidence that the last time I had a proper counterculture, which is really the 60s, everything after that is what happened after the 60s, fundamentally. But that was hugely influenced by Blake. Blake was a big figure. Our modern sense of who Blake is was really forged in the 60s in the heat of the counterculture. And I have always assumed that just as Blake himself flourished outside of, despite himself, but, he lived outside of the big art world. He lived outside of academia. He was an independent kind of person. That's an incredibly, he doesn't fit in anywhere else, if you see what I mean. So that means the job really is to see Blake taken up by the masses, is one way to put it. And the counterculture, in the counterculture, that happened. As I say, it was such a key part of the counterculture. And so I guess I've always assumed that the future, a living future for Blake, means the counterculture. That's what a living Blakeanism would be, really. It would be a countercultural phenomenon, not an academic trend, where Blake was suddenly widely recognised for something of I don't care. So the counterculture is a real focus, yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of bridge between art and politics. And just to make that little connection, when discussing with John Game about the history of the revolutionary left, it struck both of us how much most of the left turned its nose up at the counterculture and saw it as a diversion from the class struggle and didn't really connect with it at all. There's a few stories about, when they occasionally did, Tariq Ali and John Lennon, hanging out together or whatever, but by and large it didn't. And it certainly never had any success with it. And I find that deeply interesting and a massive mistake, actually. So, yeah, the counterculture is really important to my thoughts, but whether the counterculture actually exists is itself debatable at the moment.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually, whether it did exist. I think you've got a good piece on the KLF, or is it specifically on Bill Drummond's Death Project?
Oh, that's a KLF project, the People's Pyramid. So for those that don't know, the idea is to build a pyramid, and you can nominate to have yourself baked into a brick, or your ashes baked into a brick after your death, and then your brick is added each year. The bricks of everyone who's died that year, who's committed themselves to the People's Pyramid, are added to the pyramid. They're currently working on the top of the pyramid. There's an annual ceremony, and I've been up to Liverpool. It's always in Liverpool. It's a Toxteth thing. I've been up to Liverpool for it, and there's a good few hundred people there, and it's a fantastic event trying to claim back death. But the KLF are absolutely at the centre of it, yeah. I'm as interested as anybody else to find out what is the point of the traveller in the evening, and I think we slowly find out by pursuing the different threads that are out there. And they have been ecological and political, as we've repeatedly talked about, but they've also very much been about art as such. I wrote a long review of Ithell Calhoun exhibition at St Ives. And that's inspired a lot of thoughts in me about, the connections between surrealism and magic. I'm quite annoyed that Andre Breton's work on magic art was supposed to come out, 8 months ago. But it was finally released this week. You were able to get a copy. It was annoying because it came out after I'd reviewed the Ithell Calhoun, all around the theme of the relationship between surrealism and magic. Now, the Ithell Calhoun really got me thinking about it, because what it got me thinking about is, so the idea is that surrealism basically is automatism. It's the idea that you get out of the way, or rather you get the conscious mind out of the way in order for what is not the conscious mind. I'm trying to choose my words quite carefully, but in order for what is not the conscious mind to speak. This is the essence of surrealism. And so everything hinges really around this question of, well, what is this thing that isn't the conscious mind? How far does it go? And normally you think, well, you're talking about the unconscious, aren't you? And the unconscious has the peculiar quality of, on the one hand, being just the mirror side of the conscious, which is very egoic in a way. So we all know there's this idea in Heidegger, that you use a tool it becomes a sort of prosthesis, isn't it? It becomes an extension of you. It's not you manipulating a tool. In a sense, you fuse with the tool. So in other words, your sense of what it is, your being, is flexible. It can extend to include tools, for example. What the Colquhoun made me think about was, so you have this idea that automatism gets the conscious mind out of the way in order to allow everything else to express itself. And in the first instance, people take this reversed Cartesian view of the unconscious as just as surely in my possession as the ego is me, is how they begin to think about it. But you can extend it, as you say, through Batesonian kind of awareness of different, for example, different levels of consciousness within the body. The idea that we could have sub-personalities, and thereby you extend this idea of the unconscious. What I'm trying to suggest is, and what I think Ithell Colquhoun takes for granted as a magician, is that sometimes what is being liberated exceeds the personal, becomes the transpersonal. And so she could conceive of it in terms of connecting with earth forces, for example, but it could be the traditional magicians, spirits and demons and all kinds of things. But whatever they are, you can imagine that you communicate with them. When I say communicate, maybe you're like different ends of a guitar string, you're vibrating together. But in some sense, the net result is the transpersonal. That's the key thing I'm trying to get at. So it made me very interested in the relationship between magic and surrealism, because I began to see Colquhoun as somebody who had extended surrealism. And really, because she was a woman, it's never been absorbed into the mainstream of surrealism. This extended sense of what it is on the other side of consciousness. I have had, several careers as an electronic engineer, as a CEO, and starting an IT company, as well as all sorts of other things. It just seems peculiar too that they should cohere somehow, but I find that they are beginning to cohere. It's a pretty weird thing. Whenever you say you're going to combine Christianity with anything, it sounds like everything's going to get watered down, isn't it? But maybe that's just our image of Christianity. I don't see anything much watered down about the original Christians. They say they really all got crucified one way or the other. Through the apostles, they weren't appeasers as such. So maybe we just need to change or somewhat update our idea about what Christianity actually implies, as well as actually as connecting with some of the real history of Christianity.
You went to the Navy and were reading, I don't know, Enemy or whatever you were reading. It you were subversive culturally within the Navy, so it must have started earlier.
I think it came from my abusive dad. I just always used to look at him and think, I'm just like much better than you are. You don't whether you hit me or you can kick me from arsehole to breakfast. I just will be a better person. So I just felt, what I'm trying to say by that is I felt that you couldn't acknowledge that. So the reality and the way you behaved all day was sort of radically out of sync with how you saw your relationship with them. And I increasingly see that as kind of a bit narcissistic, You're sort of forced onto the outside of things by in an abusive family. There's a lot that you just can't discuss. I just think it does lead towards a sort of mentality of everything over there is a sham. The whole building is rotten at the core. It's all standing there like it's always going to stand there, but it's not. So thank you very much, Conor, for offering to come and beat me up. And thank you very much to everybody who listened in this far. I say every week, and I'm going to say it again this week, it doesn't matter how you ended up hearing this podcast because it gets syndicated through all kinds of systems that I know nothing of. They all refer back to the travelerintheevening.com. So that's one word, thetravelerintheevening.com. And that'll take you to the Substack. Please go there and subscribe. And if you can afford it, take out a paid subscription. I don't know what it'll buy you. But thanks, everybody, and I'll see you the next time around.